Good afternoon. Good afternoon. We're gonna promise keep our talking to a minimum up here and get open to the discussion in a little bit. But I want to thank you all for coming to our panel this afternoon. This is Opposing Current Wars is the name of the panel. What I'm going to tell you about who I am and who these guys are real quick. But first I want to tell you a little bit more about the panel and the conversation we're going to have today. We have been tasked with talking about opposing current wars, but obviously we're here at a function commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam peace movement as well. So we've asked each of the participants today to talk a little bit about how the lessons of the Vietnam movement influence their work today, the lessons they take with them in their work, the lessons they've learned, some of the lessons we've perhaps forgotten, and then how that impacts our work today opposing current wars. I'm sure we'll have lots of opportunity for questions to open up to other things along the way. So I'm Stephen Miles. I'm the Advocacy Director at Win Without War. And many of these folks here are coalition members of Win Without War, and they do all of the amazing work that actually gets done by our coalition. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about them and let these guys take it away. First is Gerald. He serves as the American Friends Service Committee's Policy Impact Coordinator at the Office of Public Policy and Advocacy. Since immigration to the United States in 2005, he's worked on political, cultural issues pertaining to U.S. engagement in the Arab and Muslim world. Widely recognized as an expert on political, social, economic developments in the Middle East, testified numerous congressional hearings and briefings, also a frequent guest on national and international media outlets in both Arabic and English. Born in Baghdad to an Iraqi mother and a Palestinian father, Raed grew up in Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Iraq. He received his bachelor's degree in architecture as well as a master's in architecture with a specialty in post-war reconstruction. And he's done lots and lots of media, and he's here today to tell us a little bit more about his current work. And I would also add, we all owe him a bit of a congratulations. He's celebrating the 1 week birth of his baby daughter.
Thank you so much.
You're awake.
I am not very awake. So.
We thought he could go first in case he needs to take a nap.
Right.
Well, thank you, Stephen, and thank you everyone for coming. I'll use my 5 minutes to speak about my experience, and I think I fall at the end of the spectrum in this panel with people who were influenced by the Vietnam War because of both my age and geographic location where I was born. I was born in Iraq in the late 70s, and after the Vietnam War was over. And I didn't really know that much about the Vietnam War until I came to the US in 2005. Of course, I knew the broad outline of it. But the way that the Vietnam War has influenced my work as an activist in the United States has been significant, whether I knew it or not. I will speak about a couple of examples of that. One of them is the power of telling narratives, the competing narratives. I came to the US not really knowing what happened in Vietnam. And for me, learning about Vietnam is similar to what an ordinary American would be trying to explore and learn about Iraq. It's this country out there, many of the vast majority of Americans have never been to Iraq or to the Middle East. Actually, the vast majority of Americans have never left the US. That's so I try to relate to that because in the case of Iraq, I was there. I grew up there, and I was there all through the US wars since 1991. And when I came to the US, I was really surprised at how Iraq in the US is very different than Iraq that I lived in, the Iraq that I grew up in. The war that's going on there is very different than the war that the American public are informed about. I mean, a few examples of that would be the narrative about sectarian tensions and divisions in Iraq. The conventional wisdom in the US, for a good reason, because that is how mainstream media and politicians have been covering Iraq for a few decades. The mainstream narrative here is that Iraq was a country divided by sectarian conflicts all along, And that is one of the issues that I've been speaking about since I came to the U.S. That, as you know, from my experience as a person who is half Sunni and half Shiite, we never had these tensions before 2003. That's a very different story than what we hear here. Or even if you want to focus on the most recent stories that are being told now about ISIS being this very scary monster who we have to interfere and destroy because it's uniquely evil, and we have to help our good allies in getting rid of ISIS. Even these stories don't make any sense when you check for evidence on the ground. It seems that the situation in Iraq and in Syria suggests that it's a different picture. There are many criminal groups there, including ISIS, and we're supporting some criminals against others. So it's not really a story of one bad guy in the region that we are stepping in to save the day with our allies. Our allies are beheading people. They're raping women. They're committing ethnic cleansing and crimes against humanity and war crimes. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have been documenting the crimes of ISIS and the crimes of our allies. They're at the same level. So I'm saying that's a very different narrative from what we hear in the media. And so that's why I think that the power of telling stories, for me again, when I hear about Vietnam, I don't think the Vietnam War is over, because we're still fighting until this day to write history for what happened then, and to make a point about that, about how did the war start, how did the war go, and how did the war end. Let me end by saying that I see many similarities between the war in Iraq, the war now in Syria, Afghanistan, Vietnam. And when you take one step back and look at the root causes for why we have this mentality in the US to engage with the rest of the world, I think it becomes more apparent that Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan and Vietnam are actually symptoms of more or less the same policy. And one thing I want to focus on in that regard is our military spending. Not many people know how much money we spend on our military. The official numbers are, somewhere between $400 and $500 billion. If you add up all of the, Pentagon spending and other military spendings under the Department of Environment, it comes up to $650 billion. But if you actually add up all of our national security spending, including spending on veteran affairs and and our interest on national debt, it adds up to $1 trillion a year. 2015, we'll be spending over $1 trillion on national security. It's a crazy number when you think about it. That is equivalent to our entire discretionary spending budget. It's amazing the number of money that we spend there. And keep that in mind, peace doesn't pay the bills all the time. War makes a lot of money for many people. And that's why this is something that I think sometimes is missing from our analysis, as to how to look a little bit at the bigger picture. I use my 5 minutes. Let me stop here and give some time to go.
Red couldn't have set up Joe Comerford, our next speaker, any better. In addition to her current role as the campaign director at MoveOn.org, Joe was most recently the executive director at the Nationals Priority Project, which existed to spread this message of how much money we were spending on the military. She's traveled extensively, offering budget talks, facilitating workshops, and previously served as director of programs at the food bank in Western Massachusetts and a director of American Friends Service Committee, Western Massachusetts. We didn't sit these guys together. Works out well. She's also been a frequent media contributor with pieces appearing all sorts of various places. Has a Master of Social Work from Hunter College and is an adjunct assistant professor at Smith College School of Social Work. Take it, would you?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Stephen. I'm also really delighted to be here. I loved the prompt that Stephen offered us when we were thinking about the workshop, because actually it allowed me to remember way back So one of my earliest memories in terms of how I'm affected by the Vietnam War as an activist today was when my dad and my aunt, who was a sister of St. Joseph on the Lower East Side working with Dorothy Day, my dad drove a van load of Sisters of St. Joseph down to the Vietnam War protest. And I remember I wanted to go, right? I just remember that, and I remember actually getting out of bed and waiting on the stairs for them to come home. And it was a blustery night, and they walked through the door, and these incredible women who were going to camp out on the floor of my family's house, and my father, after the protest, and I said, I was, whatever, I think I was 3 years old, and I said, what was it like? What happened? And my father said, I will never be the same again. He was radicalized in that moment. Fairly conservative man. My aunt was not conservative. If you know the Sisters of St. Joseph, they're a radical bunch. You don't mess with them. And so my father became politicized, and later on in his life, he would say that just going to that one demonstration and then the very small actions he took subsequent to that made him feel like he was part of a movement. And so one of the lessons that took away from me, so there's people on the spectrum of the Vietnam War movement, like the Sisters of St. Joseph and other radical beings, right? And then folks like my father, they were together in this recreating of a United States, really, or the fabric of the United States at that point, with people rising up and contributing in the ways that they can. And so the lesson I took away from that was a movement has places for everyone. So they have places for a person like my dad, who was just coming to the political reality, and then they have places for leaders to surface that are so critical, and they drive us forward. And I don't think that's easy to do in organizing, to create, I call it the Salt March-esque, right? So Gandhi's Salt March, where everybody had a part. And I saw that, at least in my own family's experience, replicated with Vietnam. People felt important. They felt like they wanted to contribute. They felt like they wanted to take hold, even in a modest way. And there were, discussions on the corners, and that just translated into something so much larger, as we know, that propels us forward. The other thing that I think is absolutely true, at least it was when I was first at the Service Committee, was it felt like when the Iraq War started and we were all back out on the streets, there was an absolutely critical baton pass from the Vietnam War era activists to the activists working in the streets during the rise, the time before the Iraq War, and then, of course, while we were deep in it. And I had colleagues at Move On who tell stories about being young activists on the streets and having Vietnam War era activists say, no, you want to do it this way, or no, we're going to do it this way because it always worked like that. And there was a passing of knowledge and import that folks now working at Move On absolutely credit to building them up as organizers. The other thing that I think is absolutely true is that the way in which the Vietnam War movement integrated so powerfully and necessarily race and class with peace work, right? We've heard that today. Congressman Dellums, Tom Hayden talking about Dr. King, right? There was a deep analysis that connected these issues that I actually don't know that we're doing as good a job of today, that we clearly need to, but clearly there are people who make these connections, right? We heard the connections between Ferguson and Baltimore made today with what's happening in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, with what's going on with Iran. And I think that that's a critical piece of work, again, that has its roots in this movement and needs to manifest in, I think, a much greater way today. And I will also say that, okay, I still have a couple of moments. That the other thing that I don't have good enough words, I think, to grapple with this, and I'll just use Iran right now as an example. So here we are with Iran, right? If we fail at diplomacy with Iran, there will be war. There will be significant human casualties, right? We all know that. And yet somehow the way in which activists working in the Vietnam War were able to embody the consequences of war and peace, somehow we're not able to embody that somehow in the way we're talking about what's happening right now in the Middle East the reality that will come if we fail to hold up as Americans this negotiation with Iran. And you know, I've been trying to think about that for myself. You know, what lesson do we have to draw in the way that we talk about humanity, or the way that we talk about the human consequences or the economic consequences? What connections do we have to make between our foreign policy abroad and life in the United States? And so far, I don't think we've succeeded in doing that for what's happening right now in Iran, and I actually think it will be critical in the weeks and months to come, and certainly after that, as people try to undermine this negotiation with Iran. I think it's our next best hope, in addition to what's happening in Iraq and Syria, to try to reframe that narrative and actually bring this to an end once and for all. So I'll stop.
Thank you, Judith. Next up is Jody Evans. Jody's been a peace, environmental, women's rights, social justice activist for over 40 years, traveling extensively. I'm envious of your passport stamps at this point. To war zones, promoting and learning about peaceful resolution of conflict. Served in the administration of Governor Jerry Brown and ran his presidential campaigns. She published 2 books, Stop the Next War Now and Twilight of Empire. Produced several documentary films, including the Oscar and Emmy-nominated Most Dangerous Man in America, The People Speak, and the Oscar-nominated The Square. Jody co-founded Code Pink, Women for Peace, and has been working to stop U.S. military interventions overseas and promote diplomatic solutions. She also sits on the host of boards in the movement, and I'm going to let her take it away from here.
Thank you. Nice to be with you. I just want to riff off of you for a second.
Sure.
It's the power of the draft. Answers 2 of your questions, and I think that's where I come in. The power of the draft to bring us together as a country because everyone was paying the price, and the power of the draft to bring the war home to our streets. And that's where I started because in 1970 was my first protest, and it was the 2 of the kids down the block came back in body bags, and it became very real to everyone in my community. And right after that was Kent State. And so I collected signatures and delivered them to my senator at the time, Senator Cannon, and he voted yes. And I was an 18-year-old and I got to vote. And that vote has meant everything to me because of how hard we fought, and that I was the first 18-year-old, the first wave of 18-year-olds to get to vote. So a victory for me, the victory of the war ending, the victory of getting the vote, the victory of wanting to continue to move forward, that the push and the edgy push was, I think, the shoulders I stand on, that you can't. I always say that tell my sons on my tombstone has to say she was just never fierce enough. Because what it takes to wake people up is way more than we can imagine, because we look at it, we have a moral sense, and we can feel it, but that incapacity to feel has gotten worse by the year. And one of, making Most Dangerous Man in America was being in Iraq and hearing all about torture and saying, wait, it's been 40 years since we had a whistleblower, and making a film so that we could be remembered the value of whistleblowers, and even Chelsea Manning releasing the Collateral Murder video, and which is like the woman running with napalm, but why does that not affect everyone in the same way? And then having an embedded media, which is really PR for the military, instead of a media that showed us the pictures and told us the stories, and we got to feel the atrocities in a way that they get watered down, and the lies are so, the media lies are so much more dense that just the brain can't even, maneuver what's real and what's not real. For me, why, as an anti-war activist, I was there in ’91. Jerry was the only politician that came out against the war, and I was fighting his heels to do it. And, but I have to say that it was really what happened in '92 that made me get up, and the day that I found out Bush was going to put forth the resolution on an innocent country, fly to DC and be outside of the White House with 6 other women. And that was that I was working in Watts. When I was running Jerry's campaign in '92, the Watts uprising happened after the Rodney King verdict, and just like in Baltimore, the Crips and the Bloods played a big role in managing it. And this guy named Akila Sherrills had done the Truce Between the Crips and the Bloods the night before. So I started working with him, teaching gang members life skills, and I thought, oh, I had this super naive idea that I would bring a circle of men together and show them that all men are the same. So I had a billionaire, I had Jerry, I had Tom Hayden, I had Jim Brown, you know, it's like, and the guys, and we went around the room and did as we did, talk about our feelings. Well, the word we used was father. And by the time we got at the end of the circle, I found out that every one of those kids' dad had been in the war in Vietnam. And I had known I lived next to a war zone, but I hadn't known it had come out of Vietnam. When I heard their stories, what their dads were like, what had done to their communities, and that 20,000 people had died in that neighborhood, more than Israel-Palestine, more than Ireland, and nobody fucking talked about it. But it just stayed this dark hole inside of my city. And then I was working with Fred Branfman there, who was part of my posse. And Fred had been the guy who came back from Laos and Cambodia and exposed the unknown crazy bombing of Laos and ended it almost single-handedly from being able to come back and tell the stories and bringing people and having those stories told and exposing that. So I think on Fred's shoulders, too, is the big piece of Code Pink, which is the pink light exposing whatever we can. But it was him telling me the stories of what happened in the Plain of Jars. And so those two things were just like, when I heard what was going to happen, I called up again and I said, you have to meet me in Washington. And, you know, in response to Bush's color-coded orange, red, and yellow, we called it pink. But definitely, those are the things that were kind of the core of our work, is how do we expose the lies? How do we be the storytellers? How do we bring the stories home? As we had knows, bringing Iraqi women, bringing women from Afghanistan. We now, you know, we've brought the stories back from Yemen and Pakistan on drones. And our drone campaign, literally you can watch when Mahdi went on her 200-city book tour and we went to Pakistan and Yemen, drone attacks dropped precipitously. It's literally a lot. So I would say watching what worked and didn't work has really been the core. With Pink and that Mahdi and I were both activists against the war, and which was a very male-driven anti-war movement. We decided it was very important that we create a women-led, very inclusive with men. Code Pink rocks with awesome men, but that having gone through that, we really felt that also being women-led was really important.
No, that's it. We'll have all more sense. Next up is Leslie Kagan, who has the longest biography, but has made me promise not to read it all. So she it does say, and I think this is worth noting, that the first major mobilization she worked on was 1967 March on the Pentagon, where she organized the single largest contingent of buses, 21 from New York.
No,
Your bio?
From NYU.
From NYU, I'm sorry, from NYU. Served on National Steering Committee at Student Mobilization at the Committee to End the War in Vietnam, worked in the staff of the National Mobilization Committee, and a lifetime of organizing in the movement. I wanted to note she's also additionally organizers of some of the largest and best mobilizations in the country, including the million-person nuclear disarmament demonstrations in New York in 1982, the historic lesbian and gay rights marches in Washington, October 1987, largest mobilizations against the Iraq War on February 15th, and most recently the People's Climate March in New York, bringing 400,000 people out into the streets.
Good. Good for me. And yet we still have war. All of that, and obviously none of that was done just by me, obviously, you know, lots of folks, but time is short. So a few things. One, just some context setting. If these facts are right, and I believe they are, the U.S. has been at war 93% of the time of the life of this country, right? So between 1776 and now, that's 239 years, all but 12 years we've been at war. Right? And if I've done the adding right, something like 84 of those years were wars against, or included, wars against indigenous people on this continent. I think this is really important to remember when we think about where we are now and where we're going. That war is part of the fabric of the culture, the economy, the mindset, certainly the mindset of the powers that be in this country. So, in terms of looking at some of the lessons from the Vietnam War, one lesson I know, I was one of those people, I'm of that generation, that was profoundly influenced both by the war and the anti-war movement. One lesson of that war is that wars are not accidents. They are not mistakes, as that war still is often talked about. They come directly out of our own history, but they come out of the current policies and practices, both domestic and foreign, and often directly related to the economic policies, domestic and foreign. Two is that how wars are fought are above and beyond the technology that's used, but how they're fought is so tied to the larger reality of the social systems that we live with. I'm particularly thinking of racism and colonialism and patriarchy and imperialism, right? Those shape how the wars are conducted. So it's no accident, I forget what the percentage are, but a greatly high disproportionate number of Black and Latino men in Vietnam were injured, more so than white men, right? There's no accident that happened. It's no accident to me that the rhetoric, the language, the justification for the wars, be they in the Middle East or in Southeast Asia, wherever, are so often couched in racist terms. And if we're not dealing with those pieces of it, it's going to be very hard to counter the war machine. One other big lesson that I got anyway was that it is incredibly hard to stop a given war, to focus energy on a specific war, and at the same time to be talking about this bigger context and the causes of war. We have to figure out a way to do that. Right? We can't ignore the fires that are burning, the wars that are going on, just to have a discussion about the big picture and the causes of war. And yet, if we don't talk about the big picture and the causes, then this war might end, but then another war happens. So at some point we have to figure out how to get to those root causes of war. Because without that, we're just going to be over and over and over again. One piece of how we deal with confronting wars, and they are very hard to stop. And let me just be clear, I really think, and I think only one person said it last night, I forget who it was now, I think it was McReynolds, and I really agree with him, that we played a role in helping to stop the war in Vietnam. But the Vietnamese anchored that work. They paid the heaviest price. They defeated the U.S. military machine. And if we don't say that over and over again, then not only are we doing them a disservice, we're not being honest about ourselves and our own role. And that is really important. And it is hard to stop a war from any end, especially when you're up against, and it was true then, and it's even more true now, the most horrendous, the strongest, and most powerful military force in human history, with the most incredible technology. At the push of a button, literally, people's lives are lost. So, you know, we are up against some big odds. So what do we do in the face of that? One, again, lesson from the anti-war period then was you have to make a fuss. And it's not only from there, it's from many pieces of our own history that we learn this lesson. You have to make a big public fuss. You have to make a stink. You have to raise hell. You just have to be in their face. You can't do this by, you know, kind of nice talk in back rooms. Some of that may have to happen, right? You may have to do the behind-the-scenes negotiations and this and that. But mostly you need to put massive numbers of people in motion in all the different ways that people can be and should be in motion. And people just have to, I don't want to overstate this, but just kind of run wild. I'm sometimes, to say quite honestly, given the state of the world we live in, I'm a little horrified that we aren't running a little more wild. Things are so awful. How can we sit but still, right? So you have to do that. Now, I happen to believe that the degree to which you can be coordinated and creative in that work, you know, you might be a little more successful. But short of that, at least have people in motion, get people out there in the streets. I don't believe that in the end, that our ability to challenge power is going to be grounded in rational arguments and giving them the facts. The rational arguments and the facts are important for winning people over to our position. But in terms of challenging power, it's just going up against them. And we have to be creative. I don't think we go up against them with the same types of tools. I don't think we start driving armored vehicles through our communities. I don't think we start, you know, looking like a military operation. We have to be creative in how we do that. But if we're not creative, we're not bold, and we're not visible out there, then nothing is going to push them. We have to push them. I also have to think that effort, that force, that public creativity and energy helps those who are a little more committed to an insider strategy. It helps them have more room to push. And I think you need both of those. Let me see, I know time is short. A few more of the many thousands of things here. That one of the other, I think, really big lessons, two other things I want to say. One of the other really big lessons from the war was that and the anti-war movement, is that once people are engaged, and I mean really engaged, not just they go to one demonstration or they write one letter to their elected official, but really engaged, other doors begin to open. Once people see one set of problems, they connect to other. We have not, as a movement, figured out how to take advantage of that, how to build on that, how to create even more openings. And once one social change movement begins to feel its muscle and exercise that muscle, it helps other movements. Our movements are not in competition with each other. And all too often, people act as if they think they are. So the civil rights movement, which I think is a foundational piece for all the other movements that came since World War II, certainly, the civil rights movement helped feed the anti-war movement. The anti-war movement, in turn, helped feed the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. All of that helped feed the women's movement, the LGBT movement, the Chicano movement, all the other movements that came out of that. And that's a good thing. The challenge is how to harness that. Again, not to box people in, not to limit the power of individual movements, but how to harness that so we are all more effective to reach the big goals, which are, again, stopping the immediate wars that are going on and getting to those root causes. The other final thing I'll say now is this question of unity. People talked about it a lot last night. So I came out of the anti-war movement in the 60s also believing that unity was like the central challenge and thing that we had to strive for. I came to learn through some very painful efforts around the first Iraq War, especially, and then the second Iraq War, unity in what kind of unity? What are we talking about? Unity with who, first of all? Unity cannot mean that we bring together, I believe it cannot mean simply that we bring together every left sectarian group and put them in a room together. That is not going to do it. It has to be unity of the diverse communities and constituencies that make up this country. And that is hard. That means going right smack up against the history and the legacy and the ongoing reality of race and class and gender issues. We have to take that on, otherwise we're not going to build unity. But unity has to be based on something. There has to be, I believe, a commitment to democracy within our own ranks, a commitment to being inclusive, which is a lot easier said than done. And I think it has to be a commitment, we have to have a commitment in the building of that unity to encouraging and nurturing and taking leadership from those communities that are on the front line of whatever the particular struggle is. That is critical, because otherwise the unity is meaningless and usually means that middle-class white men, straight white men, are in charge of the unified effort.
And you have very long demonstrations with a lot of speakers.
So this question of unity, I think, still plagues us. I think it is important to reach great degrees of unity, but in what way? And who's the we that we're trying to unify? And then really finally is, again, as we look at the wars overseas, and they are ongoing, and they are brutal, and they are horrendous, and they are in our name, and they are without tax dollars. We cannot ignore the wars in our own communities, the wars against people of color, the wars against women, the wars against LGBT people, anybody considered on the fringe, that the people in power see those communities, we are part of those communities, as disposable. And we cannot tolerate that. So that has got to be an integral part of our work. It's a very big agenda we have, but if we don't rise to the occasion, then the horrible mess that the world is in now is only going to get worse. So we have to get out there and do it.
Thank you, Leslie. Last on the panel before we get into the Q&A is Michael McPherson. Michael is in his second tour, I understand it, as Executive Director of Veterans for Peace. Second tour was something I got off of the VFP website, so you guys use it. We also a board member of Military Families Speak Out. He's a former national coordinator for United for Peace and Justice. He was a field artillery officer in the U.S. Army from 1981 to 1992, fought in the Gulf War, and is currently also the co-chair of the Don't Shoot Coalition.
Okay, hello everybody, thanks for being here. So I'll try to go through this real quick. So looking at the peace movement in the context of lessons learned for us in the Vietnam era, and ways that we can build our movement today, and just listening to the different things people were saying before I even get to this, and particularly on what you were talking about with people dying in the community in Los Angeles, was very powerful. And it was difficult for me to hear as a peace activist, especially at this particular moment with the police brutality movement, which, you know, for me as a black person is not new. Even since I was a little kid, my grandmother kind of transmitted to me a distrust of the police by calling them the bull. She says, the bull's in the neighborhood, so I'm looking out the window, where's their bull at? And then I find out that the bull is the police, and obviously, you know, that's not an endearing term when you're talking about things. So I'm 50 years old, so that's been something for me all my life. So today, in many ways, I think is like 1968. In that way, one of the good things about it is it's full of possibilities, because as in 1968, and you just spoke to this, there's several movements that are afoot right now, and many people are becoming politicized. And in fact, for the past decade, there's been rise and falls of many movements. And I used to start that out with the peace movement, because we all know at some point we had hundreds of thousands of people moving around in the streets, and millions of people around the country. But really, it was maybe even before, but the anti-globalization movement prior to September 11. There was all kinds of stuff happened with that, and September 11 kind of pushed that off to the side. But we saw the immigration movement. The women's movement is still doing things, but it's not as, we haven't seen a new rise, but we've seen actions because there's been marches on Washington with hundreds of thousands of people in the street around specifically abortion. GLBTQ movement, the Occupy movement, and obviously right now the Black Lives Matters movement, which in many ways is a movement, it's about Black lives, but it's about the economic situation. What's talking about in Baltimore is really about living conditions. It's not just about police. And the police are a flashpoint. So we see a similarity in terms of what's possible today. One thing about war is war accentuates contradictions in a fair and just society. It makes it harder for the ruling class or the governing class to govern. And we saw that in the 60s into the 70s, and we're seeing it right now once again. I think the Black Lives Matter is what's happening. It's making it hard for people, for the ruling class to govern. And we need to take advantage of that, really, because if we make these connections and more, or uncover the connections. I'm starting to say uncover the connections because making them, they're connected already. Right. You know, so we don't even really need to make them. we uncover them so people can see them. Then they'll see more and more how the system is unjust and not fair on many levels. So one thing I think that we can learn from the past and somewhat the present, like in the past, recent past, when the anti-war movement was powerful, is that the intersectionality of movements can really impact things. So during the 60s, things were being intersected more than I think they are right now. During the early part of our peace movement, what we've been involved in with the Iraq War and all that, we had intersectionality because some of it wasn't what way we wanted it to be, but we had a Republican in office. He was most vulnerable because of the Iraq War, not so much Afghanistan, but definitively the Iraq War. Democrats, which mostly swelled, not just Democrats, but mostly Democrats swelled the peace movement because they were looking for an umbrella to be against the Republicans, okay? They were against the war. It wasn't like they were pro-war so that when Obama came in, they were like, oh, let's go to war. But people went to deal with their own issues. So the intersectionality was under the Republican, but then when they saw an opportunity to deal with things that they need to deal with in their silos, they left the peace movement per se, you know, not getting out in the streets, and went out in the streets on their own movements. So what's important to understand about that, though, is that when we were together, it actually impacted the presidential race. The way that Obama got into office is he rolled a peace sentiment into office. Now, we didn't mean to do that, right? That's what happened. But it shows that peace actually is powerful and has a sentiment in the population that we can use when we realize how to bring people together. It kind of happened on its own. So let's for a moment remember that when he first ran. Then let's look at his second run. And if you go back and look at the convention, peace was totally absent. Okay, in fact, they were running on war. They were running on that Obama was so strong he killed Osama bin Laden and things like that, right? So one of the things that I feel like we need to take from that is what did we do wrong or we didn't do right, or what do we need to do so that peace was still part of the politics within the body politic, not necessarily the Democrats, because I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the body politic, and then people will take that into the convention. So we need to look at that for this. Maybe it's too late for this next time period, but the time period, because we'll have many of them. We have to integrate peace into what people are looking for and how it impacts what they're doing in their own lives. Because then they'll take that into their politics. And we don't have to worry about if it's Democrat, Republican, or whatever. It's about how people are expressing and feeling about peace within their own lives. We clearly need to bring these various movements together and find ways to support each other and uncover the connections between these movements, because we will not be relevant as a peace movement if we do not do that. That does not mean taking a leading role, but involving ourselves in such a way that people see that peace at home, because people want peace in their lives, and peace abroad are connected. People need to see that, and we need, as the peace movement, we need to understand and feel it. Feel it in our hearts, in our minds, in our souls, that peace at home is connected to that peace abroad. So me as a black person, in many ways, I have no choice but to feel it, right? And if I don't feel that, I wouldn't be here, because as you know, the struggles that are going on, I mean, I'll ask this question: where am I more likely to get hurt? Am I going to be more likely to get hurt by going outside today, walking down the street, or because of what's happening in Syria or Afghanistan or Iraq? I'm more likely to get hurt by what's happening. Or my son, you know, who is 30, is more likely. So this is already alive for me. But because I was in the Army and I feel responsible for what happened in Iraq, it opened my eyes one day when I saw a sign somebody was holding, you know, pre 9/11. I mean, and I'm talking about like a month before September 11 happened. I'm in New York, and I walked by a sign with a woman saying 500,000 children have died because of U.S. sanctions in Iraq. That slapped me in the face, and I started feeling, wait a minute, I have something to do with that. So that pulled me right into wanting to have to be part of a peace movement. So once again, we have to feel it, right? And we have to help people see the connections are already there, so they feel it. And that will make a difference in their politics. And I'm just finishing this. It's got nothing to do with being Republican or Democrat, being against Democrats or whatever. It's about people feeling it in their politics, and then they'll take that into those conventions. They'll take that into whatever their politics in, and then we can make a difference, I think, as a full spectrum movement. Thank you.
Thanks. So before I'm going to ask a couple questions to these guys, and then we're going to open up and have some conversation with the audience. But before that, could I just ask everyone to say thank you to our speakers? I said last night when I was up on stage, I was humbled. I'm equally humbled to be amongst so many friends and so many great leaders in our movement. And I get to have the chair's prerogative of asking the first couple questions, which is one of the nice things about being moderator. We talked a lot, we heard in a number of your comments about narratives and stories and interconnectedness. There was the Vietnam War came home when the body bags came home to your neighborhood. One of the challenges, to be devil's advocate for a second, one of the challenges in the modern peace movement, the modern anti-war movement, is the war doesn't really come home. America, it's cliche to say, but America is not a country that goes to war anymore. Very few, being of the generation for Americans who've gone to war in these last couple of years, I certainly know a handful of folks who went to war. I know none who came home in a body bag. I know several who came home with wounds of war. But I'm also the abnormality amongst my friends from growing up. Most people I know don't know anyone who came from home. So these wars really truly don't come home. And so it becomes very difficult to tell the story and take advantage of it in a way that is a common experience for all Americans, where that unity is natural, right? Where that unity is something, people are having the same experience. So with that in mind, is there anything that you think that we can learn from the movement to help get around that challenge, or help address that challenge in our work today, even though we don't have it organically the way we did when we had the draft in the Vietnam War?
I wouldn't say just the draft, though, but I would say the media. We have an entirely different media,
Right.
And that's why we all have to be the media.
Right. Well, I was also going to say the media. I think that
was my next question.
Right. The media played a very important role during the Vietnam War. One is every single day there literally was a body count on the evening news. Right. How many? It was kind of disgusting. I mean, it was almost like the football scores were given. How many U.S. dead, how many Vietnamese dead, or Viet Cong, or whatever other word they used. But also the people saw, in addition to knowing people and having your neighbors and the people you went to high school with not come home or come home in terrible shape, people saw the blood and guts of the war on TV every night. Just as we have learned some lessons, the Pentagon and the government learned some lessons. And one lesson they learned was don't show what's going on in Iraq. They made a conscious decision that the only reporters were the embedded reporters. They made a decision. The Bush administration said you could not cover the coffins coming home, right? They would not allow reporters there.
Yeah, I had to make a movie called The Ground Truth, so somebody knew what happened to wounded soldiers in Iraq, because you didn't hear about it anywhere else.
Right. So that was that. And the other thing is that I remember reading stories in the New York Times about demonstrations on campuses around the country against the war. The mainstream media told a little bit more of the story of what we all were doing. And now it's very hard. When you have several 100,000 people in the street, you get maybe a little bit of a
Wait a second. Her first march? It was 2 days till we got the coverage, because we had to fight with the New York Times.
Right, that's right.
We had to fight with the New York Times because they didn't cover it. It was 2 days later because we just
So-
told them they
so
were
let me-
late.
let me pick
That
up-
was like 100,000 people.
Right.
Yeah, let me pick up on that point, and then we'll Brad and Joe comment on this, because that's the converse side of this, right? Is that the challenges we have in the media are also balanced against opportunities we have. We can stream live video on our computers of what's going on in Iraq or Syria. We can hear directly from folks what's going on. It's clearly not the same, but there are
Not
opportunities.
even close.
Is there ways to take advantage of those opportunities that we're not doing?
But so let me just say one thing about the media. The other thing that's different is the consolidation of the media, right?
Yep.
The number, I forget what the numbers are, but.
Like 5.
Yes, like 5 multinational corporations that own virtually all the media outlets, and they're at the mainstream media. And I agree with what George is just mumbling here, is that I think we have to take full advantage of all the technologies and the social media outlets and live streaming and everything else. It's not the same as the mainstream media. I believe, I don't know what the numbers are, but still millions and millions and millions of people in this country every night get their news on their local 6 o'clock broadcast, which is awful on any issue, not just war. So I think we still have to figure out the mainstream media piece.
But I want to say,
Yeah, Riot had his hand up first.
Right.
I just want to say that I was in Iraq before in the 90s, and it's more of a human nature than an American problem, that people don't care about what their country is doing unless they're paying a personal price for it. So when Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, we lived there, and I don't remember people being up in arms. We lived through. My family lived through. Not only that, I remember when the Iraqi army looted Kuwait and brought the merchandise to Baghdad, people were buying things from the street. And I was like 10 years old, And I thought there was some moral problem with that, to buy stolen merchandise. There was no moral outrage. So I'm saying it's not an American thing. It is a human nature. That your country is doing something out there, it doesn't really affect you. The other problem that I wanted to point out to, which is a problem that we deal with all the time, is that when U.S. interventions are not costly, we're not paying treasure and blood, no one really hears about it. Until now, we've been in South Korea for 50-something years, and it's been a long time. And I don't think many Americans, even in the peace movement, are very aware of what's going on in South Korea or the other 50 or 60 countries that we have bases at. But even in Iraq, it's the level of blood and treasure that ends up being wasted wakes up the public. And it's easier to oppose a war that's bloody and costly than oppose an intervention that is less bloody and costly. And Iraq is a good example of that. Now we're just dropping bombs from the sky. We're funding mercenary groups and proxy groups who don't really have body bags coming back home. So the point that I want to make is that these are human nature problems. I don't think we can change the human nature of Americans or any other country. It's more about how can we deal with it in a way that would help us push our messages. So when people are outraged because of the price of intervention, how can we use that to end this war and other wars? So I don't think it's more of us like saying, oh, you shouldn't only be outraged about this, because we can't really change human nature.
Right. Yeah,
And we're going to come right to you.
yeah, absolutely right. So I think if we look at the movements that have been successful, and I would say, so there's argument whether how successful the civil rights movement has been, because what we be doing, what we have to do with the Black Lives Movement right now, the civil rights movement has been successful. Well, obviously, there's a lot of things about the civil rights movement that's successful, as well as the women's rights movement, GLBTQ, etc. And narratives are incredibly important. And your point about learning about Vietnam, what narrative do you learn? So one of the things that I think happened with all those movements is that American society decided to believe in a different narrative. So a different narrative about how women should be treated, or how black people should be treated, or about GLBTQ people should be treated. So a key to all of this is getting people to see the world through a different lens, through a different narrative, and have a different understanding about our interconnectedness. That is the key, because if we don't have a narrative, and I think that's the challenge that the left in general, specifically the anti-war movement, has, and one of the things Ron Dellums said today, and one of the reasons I'm even in the peace movement, is because I came to the conclusion when I got out of the Army and I was looking at what's happening in the black community, because that was the first thing I looked at. And then I started looking at how the issues that disproportionately impact my people are impacting everybody. So then I thought to myself, well, what does this mean? Well, all this stuff is connected, and I saw peace as being the umbrella, and that's what he said. And I was like, oh my goodness, that's exactly right. So we, I believe, have to help people understand that context, and across the board, that is about peace. So Veterans for Peace is talking about peace at home, peace abroad, as a way for people to see that. And as we preach that and are ambassadors of that idea, then we can begin to develop this narrative where people see themselves similarly like they did because of the draft. They'll start to see it for other reasons. That's the key. It doesn't have to be the draft. It could be because I don't have investment in my community and look at it. It's all fucked up, right? Why is that? That $1 trillion could be spent here. I mean, there's different ways. And then the last thing I would say is that everybody who's being impacted negatively in the world because of our wars are also here in this country. So, like Ryed, for example. So we could be doing more to help people see those people, and then helping people see the connections, like people in Ferguson went to Palestine, and then all of a sudden Ferguson activists are beginning to understand the connections between, and not, they didn't make the connections, they're seeing them now because they're already connected, because Palestinians treated the people in Ferguson, it wasn't ever, they treated us. Oh my goodness, the same similar thing that's happening in Palestine is happening here. So we can do more of that, which will in some ways maybe get around that draft problem.
So we have about 20 more minutes, and we want to have a chance for some discussion. I want to just make sure we all remember that if someone stands up and talks for 20 minutes, we won't have any discussion. So in the back.
I was just very nice, interesting conversation. I was just thinking that one way to connect the impact of the war to people's real lives is through the money, which you're talking about. And I was just reading this Ryzen book, which starts out by talking about these plane loads of cash that were just sent to Iraq and disappeared into God knows where, to warlords and things like that. People don't know about that. Like $60 billion of cash was just delivered day after day. And so I think one thing, the AFSC did a good project called What I Would Have Done with $1 trillion for children, for kids, teenagers. And I went to it. It was very effective because it tied it together. But yeah, to make that connection with kids, like this, your school's program is being cut, right? Like Kansas, they're going to have to close school 2 weeks early this year because they don't have the money, you know, for a lot of districts. Like, this is money that, and in the meantime, we're spending so many billions and billions and billions, and just to make the actual money connection,
Thank you. I want to call on Judith to say a word about this real quick, but I want to stress that the next time you hear somebody talk about not having money, remember that the estimates from the Inspector General is that $50 to $60 billion were wasted in Iraq. $6 billion is completely gone, just disappeared into thin air. We've literally lost $6 billion. That's what they know that we lost. So I mean, it's a staggering amount of money. So Joe, do you want to say something about just the connecting the cost and work with the war?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, the If I Had $1 Trillion film festival was, for me, a really hopeful thing. So AFC and NBP partnered on that, and it goes to actually something that Congressman Dellums said earlier today, which I tell you, man, this might be the biggest gut punch I've felt before listening. When he said, and maybe this is resonating with you, he said, you know, what we give our young people is we give them all the things, all the reasons that things can't work, that politicians are bought and paid for, that the system is corrupt, right? That our job is to turn it around and say, no, 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 you got it, you can change this. At least that's how I heard from Dellums. And so if I had $1 trillion, that was just one embodiment of a group of organizations saying to young people, no, this is your money. These are your parents and your family's tax dollars. You dream about this money because it's yours to spend in the way that you feel is going to help your community most and help the world you live in the most. So actually that for me is something I'm taking away from this conference, is that sort of mandate to, yes, the media is bought and paid for, and yes, money in politics is absolutely a foundational issue, and we still have mechanisms. Like we were starting to, we won't have time, but we were starting to talk about public media and taking back the media and creating our own media, which is not the same thing as NBC showing it. But maybe it can be better if we do something a little bit different or join together in some sort of way. Anyway, so that was big.
Leslie, real quick.
Yeah, I also think that this is a critically important job for the task for the peace movement to take on, is making that connection that if the and the material that we all have gotten from the National Priorities Project and the work that Joe and many others done, this bomber equals X number of schools and teachers and et cetera. All that is critical, and we have to keep pushing that. I think there's a little bit of a slippery slope here, and that is, as Ed said before, that war and militarism is actually pretty profitable, very profitable, more so than a lot of this other stuff, or at least they think it is. There's a lot of cash flowing. There's jobs. Let me say this, right? Eisenhower was right when he mentioned the military-industrial complex, right? It's kind of weird to quote a Republican, but he was right about that. And there's big money in militarism. So I think what we have to, so that's one thing. The other thing is that I'm not so sure that if we cut some military spending, end X war and save whatever amount dollars, from that it automatically flows into social spending. It doesn't, right? Given the privatization move in this country and the way profit is, is the god of everything, there still is going to be a fight for funding for what our communities need and what people need.
Can I just say something? So we've had a Bring Our War Dollars Home campaign that we've partnered on for like 8 years now. And where we, being an activist, one of the things you have to notice is where can you catch the wave? And so the biggest wave on this was obviously 09. And it was in 09 that we ran a campaign. We got a mayor's resolution, first anti-war resolution out of the mayors in the United States since Vietnam to bring the money home to the needs of our community. So all this was awesome, and it educated communities, and people got out there, and they got it, and they did bake sales. But I think what happens is it's overwhelming, because it doesn't have an answer. And that's the reason I decided to launch this peace economy movement. We don't have a big enough movement right now. The movement continues to shrink. And I really learned it working in Ferguson. It was like working with the kids in Ferguson, it was like, okay, we don't want to work on elections. This fucked. The world that calls itself the world is not serving us. And they're all in building a new economy. And I went, wait, we should be building a peace economy, because at least it teaches you, because we're all stuck inside of it. We can sit here and talk all about it, but we participate in it, we make it happen. And if you start to unpack how to get out of the crazy zing that we live inside of and start to create things that are relational, because it is that. It's how do you be relational again? How do you even feel this shit again? Because it's so overwhelming that just to start to be in relationship with each other before we can even hear the stories of others.
Bill?
On the economic situation, we really need to help people understand what economics is all about, because when they did quantitative easing 3 and 4 times, and when they share through all the central banks an incredible increase in the money that's available, 100 million to 100 billion to 2 or 3 trillion isn't all that much difference. It's a matter of degrees, yes, but how can we prove how greedy, how cold, how evil these people are who do this? That is the way I see the biggest problem. And like the way they look at it is a rising tide floats all yachts, and we have to counter this thought. We have to get people familiar with BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, China, India, South. There's a lot of countries involved with this, and this new China road to hopefully to England and Russia distribution of natural gas. There's a lot of things that are going to knock America's reserve dollar, the United States dollar's reserve dollar, tied to oil from Saudi Arabia from the World War II deal. And that's what keeps us, as long as we have the reserve currency status, we can do pretty much whatever we want to do and nothing costs anything. It's all bullshit. And we have to teach people this.
So before we comment on that, I'm just going to take one more so we can get, Deborah.
Well, I mean, one big difference between the sort of World War II through Vietnam era was you had World War II and the revving up of the economy, ending the Depression, and then even though of course there's always poverty, but there was middle class prosperity, and that's gone away in the last 30 years. So that's a tremendous difference, and it's what's so ironic about it is that
the capitalist class would just be a little less greedy, they have it much better as well. But I wonder whether the connection, whether part of a connection is that that young people need more options than just joining the military, so some, you know, whether to come at it through the kind of I mean, there's a fledgling movement around minimum wage and you know, and in the fast food industry, and whether there's I think it's become such a truism that so many people believe that, you know, if a young person joins the military, that's great. It's going to straighten them out. They'll send them to school. You know, and is there a way to you know, to debunk that and then bring forward the idea that that there should be that's not enough. There need to be different opportunities. Not just a thought.
All right. Any thoughts?
Well, just on that, I think that, to my mind anyway, speaks to what Gerald was talking about, a peace economy. That, you know, which, in my mind, a peace economy means free education for everybody, for one thing, right? From preschool to postgraduate or free education for everybody. And part of that is job training and new jobs. It also means converting, right? Converting from building, you know, bombs and missiles and stuff to building public transportation systems and housing and you know, healthcare facilities and stuff. And so you have to have jobs also for young people. But you also need, you know, arts and sports and other things that people can engage in so that they feel whole.
You need to reduce the work hours of the people who are working 50 hours a week.
Right.
So there are enough jobs.
Well, I think plenty of jobs can be created. Just look at the infrastructure of this country and the bridges and the tunnels and the roadways that all need to be redone. Right, to say nothing of the major job that needs to be done that has to do with the climate crisis. And the retrofitting of buildings and the building of solar panels and windmills, and that there are plenty of jobs to be created at the foundation is a peace economy.
We're going to take two more real quick and then we'll get responses. So this gentleman here.
Two of the things. One is sometimes we're all our worst enemies. If we're supporting telephone companies like AT&T, Verizon, and all the rest of that, that's your worst enemy.
Credo.
Credo. That's not what Credo. If everybody in this room doesn't use Credo as a phone company, you're your own worst enemy. Also, where you get your electricity, where you get your power. The power company I use is all wind.
Ethical wind.
And it's ethical power. Yes, yeah, exactly. If everybody here isn't doing that, it's not right. And one thing the peace movement should get involved in is getting money out of politics. We should be part of Represent Us, or is a thing called Wolf Pack, where it's going state by state, rather than trying to change it federally. It's going state by state. I think right now there's 13 states that have laws on the books that all public money, any money that's given to a political campaign has to be opened up. If you gave money to it, your name has to be out there and you have to see it. And once we start getting money out of politics, we can change the thing. Right now there's 6 corporations that own 90% of the media. Our message ain't gonna get out until we get the money out of politics. We know where that money's coming from.
And the gentleman in the hat, you wanted to say something yourself?
Yes, I think a unifying factor is basically a question of human needs and human rights. That's the subtext of everything. In terms of what we're talking about, you have to understand the emotional element there, and that's how they connect it immediately for them. Because I can tell you I was a victim of severe human rights violation. This is an upper middle class condominium, and they don't care about even their own selves. The 1% or the 1% aspirin. They all screw each other in order to save a dollar.
Can we get comments on these last few? We have 5 minutes left, so comments on these issues and close out. No pressure.
Comments and close out in 30 seconds. I just want, one factual issue that came up is how much money we spent on Iraq on the war. I'll just dedicate my 1 minute for that. The U.S. has spent, or will end up spending, almost $3 trillion on the Iraq war alone. There was a CRS report that came out in December, showed that so far we've actually spent $1.6 trillion on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan without calculating the interest on national debt. If you put the interest on national debt, it actually goes more than $2 trillion. Of course, the expenses will go on because of what we're spending on veterans and other issues. In addition to that, Iraq and Afghanistan spend huge amounts of money. Iraq's annual budget is $120 billion. Iraq's annual budget is larger than the budgets of Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt combined. And these are countries with 4 times the population of Iraq. So Iraq has spent another couple $1 trillion in the last 13 years on nothing, on destruction and on death. I mean, like, this issue of the military spending is something that is happening this year. Right. It's not a theoretical discussion. This year, what's happening this year is that politicians are trying to bust the caps from military spending and keep the caps on domestic human needs. This is happening now as we're talking. And it's something that we should all of us be very concerned about, very involved with. You know, to say no to busting the caps on military spending. You know, AFSC and other of our coalitions have some ideas about that. Maybe we can discuss after the session, ideas of parity, ideas of a firewall, trees, you know, different ideas. But what we're heading to is not only continuing the crazy levels of military spending, we're actually increasing it and decreasing human needs. So that is one of the issues that is definitely happening this year, and I hope everyone will get involved.
Really quickly, to your point about money in politics, there is right now, and maybe folks know, a very large push led by Public Citizen and others to have President Obama sign an executive order requiring federal contractors to disclose. It's a tiny little baby step, but who are those main federal contractors? Many of them are defense contractors, so there's a whole big parallel movement getting ready to catch that, because we think he's going to do it. And when he does it, we'll be able to actually start to chart the connections between these big money siphons and the politicians they buy. So that's out there for us as a potentially another pivot, another strategy. And then the other thing that we started to talk about, this builds off of Jody's peace economy. You know, there's one of our colleagues from Institute for Policy Studies, Marilyn Pemberton, who's been working up, you know, in our larger community on transition economies. And again, it's tiny, right? Miriam's one intrepid person, and there are other, of course, people working with her. But the kind of work that Jody is talking about and others are talking about is the kind of transformative work, if we could figure out how to scale it, scale the thinking about it, scale the money for it. Right now, this transition economy work is inside the Pentagon. It's the Office of Economic Adjustment, is the money that comes to workers in cities that need infrastructure rebuilding to rebuild if their industries are pivoting. Anyway, this is ours to scale if we want it. So it's another avenue.
And I just invite you to join, we have our next Mayor's Resolution campaign. The last one was successful, and this one is to demilitarize our cities. Because as we got to see, while Gaza was happening, a war in our own country in Ferguson, and you talk to your mayor, get them to sign onto the resolution. The mayor's conference is in June, and stopping 1033 is really important because what's happening in our country is not going to stop unless we stop it now.
Just one thought that came to mind is that recently, about 3 weeks ago, I saw a comic that we had a war on drugs and the drug problem exploded in this country. We had a war on poverty, and poverty expanded in this country. Maybe what we need now is a war on farmers markets. So anyway, the main thing I just wanted to say was that I somehow forgot, even though it's the main thing I'm working on these days, is the climate crisis, and that there is a war on the planet. And it's linked to all these other things, and I think that from my limited experience in this movement, in the climate movement, is that if we, the peace movement, don't push this connection and the role of the military. The U.S. military is still the largest user of fossil fuels. We go to wars for oil. The wars create environmental nightmares. All those connections. We need to be pushing those connections, and we need to push hard because, as Michael said, the connections are there. We just need to help more people see them.
And Michael, last word?
Yeah, so the thing about the concentration of wealth, about war being a moneymaker, is really a concentration of wealth maker. Right. And I think more so than it's because other things can make money, but it'll be dispersed amongst the people. Right. The biggest thing I think is we need a new paradigm, and we need to develop a new narrative. And I just want to challenge us to think about, and this sounds crazy to some people, but I really think the central issue is male supremacy and patriarchy. Because the way that everything is approached is, and that doesn't mean that us men are bad, but if you approach everything from that particular point of view and not have a diversity of points of view of how we do things, what we got is what we get. Just think about how we all as men are together bumping chests and talking shit to each other. That's what's going on in the world right now. And so just lastly, when we talk about the shift of power from the United States to China, if we don't have a new paradigm, it'll be the same thing that's up with China. Imperialism is old, it is not new. War is old, it is not new. We need a new way as humanity, not just the United States. Humanity needs a new direction.
So, thank you, Michael. Before we give these guys one last round of applause, I'm supposed to tell you that you're all supposed to next go to the sanctuary, which is either, I think everyone knows where that is. You can go in the balcony from right here, or you can go down to the second floor. But I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone here. Thank you to you all for coming.
Thank you. Good job. Good job. You're a wrangler.
I was a kid with